كنيسة سان هوزيه المفروض إنهم وصلوا برضه. النهارده بعد اجتماع الخدمة بتاعهم فقالوا ناخد بركة سيدنا يعني ونيجي. يعني هم وصلوا يعني. طب نقول حاجة نحفظ حاجة نقول لبيت الصليب نقول الصليب هو سلاحنا، الصليب هو رجائنا، الصليب هو ثباتنا في ضيقاتنا وشدائدنا. نقولها تاني. الصليب هو سلاحنا، الصليب هو رجائنا، الصليب هو ثباتنا في ضيقاتنا وشدائدنا. الصليب هو سلاحنا، الصليب هو رجائنا، الصليب هو ثباتنا في ضيقاتنا وشدائدنا. نقول كمان. الصليب هو سلاحنا، الصليب هو رجانا، الصليب هو ثباتنا في ضيقاتنا وشدائدنا.
O Lord, make us worthy to pray thankfully. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Through Christ Jesus our Lord, for thine is the kingdom, power, and glory forever.
We have our blessed and honored Father, the Archbishop Patriarch Abathar II, and his deputy of the Archdiocese, the northwestern area of the USA, Abuna Antonius Day, and Abuna Salib, Abuna Ibrahim, and also the board of deacons of our church, servants, and we have you too. I want to say welcome to Sayyidina. This is his first visit to our church Sayyidina Abba Suriel, the Bishop of Melbourne. Sayyidina Abba Suriel got PhD of the writing and the life of Habib the Archdeacon. I will not talk about Sayyidina, you will see Sayyidina, you will see his speeches, sermons, he will talk about the church during 100 years from Habib Girgiz's life and the Sunday school and what did he do for our church. Welcome Sayyidina to our church. فاكرين المراد اللي احنا بدأنا دلوقتي قلنا مع بعض؟ حافظينه؟ نسيتوه؟ طب نقول تاني بالعربي. الصليب هو سلاحنا، الصليب هو ثبتنا في ضيقاتنا وشدائدنا. نقول مع بعض. الصليب هو سلاحنا، الصليب هو جناح، الصليب هو ثبتنا في ضيقاتنا وشدائدنا. نقول تاني. الصليب هو سلاحنا، الصليب هو جناح، الصليب هو ثبتنا في ضيقاتنا وشدائدنا. تقولوا لوحدكم؟ الصليب هو سلاحنا، الصليب هو نعمل ترنيمة الله الذي لنا مع بعض. الله الذي لنا لا يتركنا أبدا، بل يهدينا ويحمينا عينه علينا. الله الذي لنا لا يتركنا أبدا، بل يهدينا ويحمينا عينه علينا. ربنا لا ينسانا وهو دائما معنا، ربنا لا ينسانا وهو دائما معنا. في طريق ذي الحياة يتقدمنا، في طريق ذي الحياة يتقدمنا. معنا
معنا وسط رحبنا يبهج قلوبنا وفي ضيقنا يسد كل عوزنا ربنا لا ينسانا وهو دائما معنا ربنا لا ينسانا وهو دائما معنا في طريق ذي الحياة يتقدمنا في طريق ذي الحياة يتقدمنا نرفع رؤوسنا أمام عدونا لا نهاب الخصم كلا فمن علينا ربنا لا ينسانا دائما معنا ربنا لا ينسانا فهو دائما معنا في طريق ذي الحياة يتقدمنا في طريق ذي الحياة يتقدمنا. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, one God, Amen. First of all, I wish all of you a blessed feast of the Holy Cross. As you know that we celebrate the feast of the Holy Cross for 3 days. It's a great joy for me to be here at St. Antonius Church in Hayward in the Bay Area in San Francisco. As Abuna Antonius mentioned, that it is my first visit to your church, but not my first visit to San Francisco. I was actually here a few months ago for a short 1-week visit, but didn't get the opportunity to visit your church. So I thank very much Father Athanasius for his kind invitation and for all of you. And it is a great joy for me to spend this weekend here, and also to thank Abuna Sabib, who I know for 28 years, since 1995, when he came to be ordained a priest in Egypt, and spent his 40 days with us in the papal residence at St. Bishoy Monastery, when I was a monk there at the time, serving with His Holiness Pope Shenouda III of blessed memory. So it's wonderful to see him and to see Taswani with us as well, and also I welcome Abuna Abraham. But before I begin tonight, I also want to say that I pass on my condolences to all of you on the falling asleep of very Reverend Father Matthias Wapa, who I had a long relationship with for many years, even before I became a monk. When I used to visit Egypt several times, particularly we had 2 youth trips back in the 1980s, where a group of youth came. When a group of youth from Australia went to visit Egypt and visit the monasteries and churches there, and got to know Dr. Samuel Matthias very well, who's been a very close friend to me during all of this this time. When I was thinking about monasticism, I spent many times in the house of Abuna Matthias, and so it has been a wonderful and long relationship. And some of you may know that he also served in Melbourne, in Australia, but this was before I went to Melbourne in the early 1980s for about 2 years that he was serving there. And I know very well of his scholarship and the great work that he did in this parish here, and the many books that he wrote, and his love for Saint Athanasius. I know his PhD was on the Incarnation and also on marriage in the Orthodox faith. He was truly a blessed man, and you were lucky to have him serving you here in this parish for many, many years. May the Lord repose his pure soul and give comfort to the Sonny Nadia, to Dr. Samuel, and to John, and to all the family, indeed, to each and every one of this blessed congregation. As you know, that the main topic I was invited to speak about was around the theme of the life and legacy and the work of Saint Archdeacon Habib Gerges. And as you, I'm sure, are aware, that the Church as a whole is having a special celebration this year to celebrate 100 years of the Sunday school movement in Egypt. And this was a movement that was established by Saint Habib Gerges. It was officially established in 1918, but in fact, in my opinion, the Sunday school movement began before this. And we'll talk a little bit about this tonight. Tonight I will just give a general overview, and then tomorrow there's 2 more lectures on this topic, and I will go into more detail, especially about the work of Saint Habib Gerges concerning the Sunday school movement, and the second lecture about his work with respect to theological education. So these will be the 3 lectures that I will give around the theme of Habib Gerges, and I think there's also a 4th lecture on a different topic, and then a question and answer session, I believe, on Sunday after the liturgy. So this will be the program as I understand it. But before I begin talking about this, I want to ask you, what do you know about Habib Gerges? What have you heard about him? So I would like for you to share with us. What have you heard about him, or what do you know about him? Yes?
Sunday school founder.
Yes, that's usually the first answer I get. Yes, he was the one who founded the Sunday school movement in the Coptic Orthodox Church. What else do you know? Well, I guess in a way I'm happy that you don't know that much, so that I feel that you will learn some new things tonight. Yes? Again? And now in 2013, he was canonized as a saint in the Coptic Orthodox Church. And I was one of the members of the synod that pushed or encouraged this to take place, because I believe, in my opinion, that what he did for the Coptic Orthodox Church was quite amazing. Even though that he may not have performed miracles or things like this, or he was not a monk or a priest or a bishop or an ordained minister. In fact, he was an archdeacon, so he was a member of the clergy. But what he did for education for the church is actually quite remarkable. So in my opinion, he certainly, and the church now approved this, that he is worthy of sainthood through the work and the life that he led, particularly in the role that he led in education. Thank you. Anything else? لا نسمع بقى ناس تانية. Anything else that you have heard about Habib Gerges? And any of the youth can share as well. Okay. So there is actually a lot to say about Habib Gerges, and if you left me to speak, I could speak for several days about him and what he has done, but we'll try to concentrate as much as we can on some of the important aspects of the legacy, the important legacy that he left for the church. Another important point for you to note is, in fact, 2 weeks ago, on the 14th of September, and probably, unfortunately, that I was hoping that there would be a big celebration on this day. We celebrated the centenary, or 100 years, since Habib Gerges was appointed as the Dean of the Theological College in Cairo, after the Dean at that time, who was Yusuf Mankarios, had passed away. The Pope at the time was Pope Kyrillos V, Pope Cyril V. Pope Cyril V was the longest reigning patriarch in our 2,000-year history. He sat on the throne of St. Mark for just over 50 years. And he was a very blessed man, and he went through also a very difficult time. We'll talk a little bit about this. But he was appointed by Pope Cyril V on the 14th of September 1918 as the second dean of the Theological College in Cairo. So this is a very significant event, and I still hope that sometime this year that the church can celebrate this important and significant event to remember the work that Habib Gerges did for theological education in our church. But we'll talk in the third lecture more about what Habib Gerges did for theological education. But I just wanted you to remember this important date. But I want to also tell you a little bit about my journey of how I became interested to do my PhD on Habib Gerges. My journey with him actually goes back to 2005, so about 13 years ago. I was in New York, New Jersey area at that time, and I began to think about doing a PhD. And I had started doing some work on doing a critical edition of the Arabic life of Saint Shenouti, the Archimandrite. And I collected many manuscripts of the Arabic text because it was translated from Coptic into Arabic. And so there were many versions of these manuscripts that I found dating back, I think, the earliest manuscript to the 13th century. And so I had about 13 or 15 of these manuscripts. The latest one was like in the beginning of the 1900s. And so I began to look at doing a critical edition and translation of that Arabic text into English as a PhD. But when I went to Fordham University, where I studied, and I went to the theology department, they said to me, for you to study a PhD here, you have to do ancient languages, you have to study Greek, you have to study Coptic, you have to learn French, German, and so on, because a lot of the scholarship, a lot of the Coptic scholarship still remains in the German language and in the French language. And so as I walked out of the the theology school there, I thought to myself, this is going to take a long time to study German, to study French, to study the ancient languages. It's going to take many, many years, even though it would have been of great benefit to do so. But I thought this was going to be a very long journey to do this. And as I was walking out of the theology school, I had one of the blessed priests from New Jersey with me, Father Antonius. Some of you may know him. He's one of the great scholars in our church and did also his PhD at Columbia University in New York on St. Athanasius. I said to him, why don't we try to go to the religious education department and see if the path that way may be easier and quicker. So we went, and I had already completed a Master's of Religious Education in Australia, so it was fitting that I could continue in that field. And being a former high school teacher in Sydney, so education was something always very important to me. So luckily the dean was there and he welcomed us. I began to speak to him about the opportunity to do a PhD there, and he was very open to the idea. This was around November of 2004. By January of 2005, I was enrolled into the religious education department and began doing coursework and began doing a qualifying paper to be approved for the PhD. And then I started to think what would be the topic. So they appointed for me a mentor to mentor me through the process. As you know, it's about a 3-year process to do a PhD if you are working on it full time. And at first I said to him, I had done my thesis in the Masters about the first 5 centuries, Christian education in the Church of Alexandria in the first 5 centuries, published as a very small booklet. So I said to him, I want to see if I could do the PhD on the 2,000-year history of religious education in the Coptic Orthodox Church. And my mentor, who was really a very wonderful man, said to me, this is a very broad topic, and this would take you a whole lifetime to write on this. So try to narrow down to a particular period of history or a particular figure that you would like to study. So as I went home and started to think some more, I thought about doing something on Pope Cyril IV. Does anyone know anything about Pope Cyril IV that you could share with us? What is he known for? Yes.
I know he's known as Abu Islam.
Yes, which means what in English?
Reformist, the father of reform.
Yeah, he was known as the father of reform. Does anyone know how long he was Pope for? Anyone know? Which years? Which years in history?
Like a few years.
Yeah, how many?
2.
More.
3.
More. Which years? Do you know from what date to what date? See, it's why I'm telling you all these details, because this is part of your identity as Copts. And living abroad in America or in San Francisco or in Australia or wherever we are around the world, we should not lose this attachment and this link with our history. And unfortunately, our modern history in the last 200 years, not many people in our church know much about it. And it's an emerging field of study, and I think it's a very rich history that you should know very, very well. Why? So that we learn from the mistakes of the past and we don't repeat them again today. So studying history, don't think of it as something archaic or meaningless. Studying history is actually something very critical and very important to understanding our church and our faith and how it operates and how we can learn from the legacy of the past and the history of the past so that we can move forward. Pope Rhodas IV, or Pope Cyril IV, was patriarch from 1854 to 1861. So only 6 years as Pope, one of the shortest periods for someone to be Pope in our church. And as you said, that he was an enlightened man and also known as the father of reform. He could see the difficulty that was in the life of the church at that time. In fact, it was a period of darkness in the life of our church in that period. And he was the one who began establishing schools for boys, and for the first time in Egypt, schools for girls. And he began to have classes for priests to teach them doctrine and theology. And he was the Pope who brought into Egypt the second printing press. The first printing press was brought by the Egyptian government, and it was this enlightened patriarch that brought into Egypt from Europe, the second printing press. He asked his bishops and priests and deacons to go to the train station in Cairo. He was not in Cairo at the time. And he asked them to make a procession with hymns to take the printing press from the train station to bring it to the Patriarchate. And he said at the time that if he wasn't in Cairo, he would have danced in front of the printing press as David the prophet danced in front of the Ark of the Covenant. Quite an amazing thing for a patriarch to say such words. But it shows you how enlightened this man was. He knew how this printing press, how it can transform the life of the Copts. Because this printing press would begin to publish books, would begin to publish magazines, would begin to publish Coptic newspapers. Like at the time there were two famous Coptic newspapers, one called Misr and the other one called the Watan. They were the two famous Coptic newspapers at the time that were printing articles and news about the church. So he wanted his people to begin being enlightened. And he knew that enlightenment will only happen through education. And education happens when people begin to read and study and to research. So he was an amazing man, and the government of the time began to be aware of his activity. And history says that he was most likely poisoned, and that's how he died, because of the threat that certain people felt that this man was going to transform the church, even though some of the leaders of the government at the time, like Abbas and others, thought that it was easier to rule an ignorant people, to keep the people ignorant, then it is easier for them to control them. And they saw that this patriarch was coming to enlighten the Copts and to bring in education and so on. At the time also was the time of Muhammad Ali Pasha, who had also began to establish schools, but he had a different purpose. What Muhammad Ali Pasha did at the time in Egypt in the middle of the 19th century was to establish schools for the purpose of strengthening his army so that he could control the whole region. And he would send some people to Europe to study and to come back to help with the establishment of these schools. But unfortunately, he discriminated against the Copts, and he never sent any of the Copts to go to study abroad in Europe. So when Pope Cyril IV saw this, he began to establish his own schools to begin to enlighten the Copts. And one of the schools that he established was the school that was attached to the Patriarchate, and this was the school where Habib Gerges studied for his primary and secondary education. But there were, at this time, as I said, it was a period of darkness in our history. And there were actually three things that were tearing away at the very thread of Coptic identity. Three things, and please remember them. The first thing was this tension that was existing between the government of the time and the authorities of the time and the hierarchy of the church. This was one issue. The second issue was that Western missionaries from Europe and from America had begun to come to Egypt, and they began to open very excellent schools with very high educational levels. And when these Western missionaries, whether Catholics or Protestants, came to Egypt, their first goal was to proselytize amongst the Muslims. So their main goal was coming to convert the Muslims to Christianity. But they failed dismally. They could not get through to the Muslim population. So what was the easy target? They turned their target towards the Copts, who were unfortunately uneducated, most of them, whether the hierarchy, whether the bishops, the priests, the deacons, the lay people, there was a lack of education, unfortunately, in the church. And so they began to target the Copts. So some of them began to go and to study in some of these elite Western schools. And so this was another problem that was existing. The third problem that was existing and was tearing away at the very identity of the Coptic Church was the tension that began to develop between the hierarchy of the church in the clergy and the lay elite that had began to be enlightened and to study, who wanted to take control of the finances of education in the church, and so a tension began to develop. And unfortunately, this tension led to the banishment of Pope Cyril V, when the lay elite banished him, and he was sent to the Baramos monastery for several months, and this was a very, very sad time for the Coptic Church, because they established at that time what was known as the Majlis al-Melli, or the Lay Community Council, and they were able to convince the authorities in Egypt at the time to banish the Pope because of this tension that was taking place. So you can imagine that all of this, we are talking just over 100 years ago. Look at our church today, where it has reached, yeah? All over the world, hundreds of churches established here in North America, tens of bishops, hundreds of priests, deacons, all of our clergy to a great extent are educated, are giving sermons, etc. But I'm telling you that just over 100 years ago, this was not the case in our Coptic Orthodox Church. It was actually a very, very dark period in our history. And this is how Pope Shenouda III of blessed memory describes this period. This is what he says about Habib Gerges. He says, our teacher, Archdeacon Habib Gerges, pioneer of religious education in our generation, started his life in an age that was almost void of religious education and knowledge. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, as the book of Genesis describes. Then God said, let there be light, and there was light, and the light was Habib Gerges. This is how Pope Shenouda III describes this saintly man. he says that the church was in this period of darkness, nothing in the church, no education. Priests would come to the liturgy, pray the liturgy, and when it came to the time of the sermon, the priest would open a book and read something from it, and that was it. There was no teaching in the church. And most of the people were not even having Holy Communion. It was a very sad, dismal situation. When you read this history, you'll be quite amazed in how this church has been transformed and kept intact during all of these difficulties, and how all these factors were tearing at the very thread of our Coptic identity of who we are as Christians in Egypt. And so that's why it's important for us to learn from this history so that we don't go back to these difficult times again, and we learn from them. No preaching, no teaching, no bishop was teaching, no priest was teaching, no deacon, nothing, not even the patriarch. Can you imagine that in all of Egypt there was only one learned priest? Do you know his name? There was only one priest who was preaching and teaching in the church. Only one priest. Do you know him? A very fascinating figure, and more should be researched about him. His name was Father Philithaus Ibrahim Baghdadi. And this man would go from church to church all throughout Cairo, Alexandria, all the way down to Aswan, preaching and teaching the people. And wherever he went, the churches were completely full of the faithful. People were hungry to hear the word of God and could not find anyone to teach them the word of God. They were hungry. They wanted to be nourished by a spiritual word, but they could not find anyone to teach them. And imagine where we are now compared to this time. The churches were overflowing. Even outside of the churches, near the windows, were open, and people were standing all around the church. And sometimes his sermons went on for 3 hours, and people were sitting there eagerly listening to him. This is about the state of the church at that time, just over 100 years ago. Remember the name of this priest, Father Philithaus Ibrahim Baghdadi. Do you have any questions so far? So please stop me at any time and ask questions. Are you finding this interesting, or it's boring for you?
It's very interesting.
Have you heard any of these things before? What?
I have a question. Why did the state happen? What led to
It happened over many, many centuries, since the maybe 3-4 centuries ago, that through many pressures that were happening in Egypt at that time, things began to dwindle with respect to religious education, lack of books, lack of schools, and so on.
How about the monastery life? Wasn't it supported?
It was, but also again this began to affect the monasteries as well, and that's why at that time they tried to establish a school for the monks to teach them about theology, but unfortunately it did not succeed in Hayward, and it shut down very quickly. Yeah.
Where did Father Philithaus learn?
He taught himself. So through reading many books and manuscripts, he began to educate himself, and that's how he became a very eloquent preacher at his time. The same happened to a great extent with Habib Gerges, and I'll tell you how in a minute.
Where can I find more of this history of the dark times of our church? Where can I?
Read my book. So I published the book last year. It's called Habib Gerges, Coptic Orthodox Educator and The Light in the Darkness. I believe it's available in your bookshop. So it will tell you a little bit about this history, and it covers quite a fascinating amount of information about the legacy of Habib Gerdes and about this dark period in our history. But you'll find also other history books that will speak about this. For example, there is a 3-volume book about the Coptic papacy. Several scholars wrote it. It is in 3 volumes. It is published by AUC Press, the American University in Cairo Press. If you go on Amazon, you'll be able to order it, or through AUC Press. And you'll find several other books, but we don't have, unfortunately, that many books about the history, especially about this modern period. And so about 2 months ago in Melbourne, we had a very important symposium where we had about 30 scholars from around the world presenting papers. The title of the symposium was Coptic Modernity, 18th to the 21st century. And so we're hoping to publish a volume on the proceedings of this symposium. So as I mentioned at the beginning, that this is an emerging field of research, this modern Coptic era. So we hope that more scholars will be interested to write more and research more and publish more about this period. It will happen. Yes?
The spread of the Arabic language, did it have a role in the dark times of the church? Because the congregation understood Arabic, but it didn't understand Coptic. And all the liturgy and all the readings and all that was in the Coptic language. So they didn't understand really what was read to them. So how would
Yes, but the church also kept up with this by translating all of its liturgical material into the Arabic language at some stage when Arabic became the official language in Egypt, so that the people would be able to follow in the language that they understood at the time. But obviously, when schools began to be shut down and we lost our Coptic language as a spoken language, which was very sad, because when you lose your language, you also lose part of your culture as well. But the church kept with that and translated the material in Arabic so that the people can still be able to understand when Arabic became the official language. Just like what happened when we came to America, right? When now most of our young people, they don't understand Arabic and English is the spoken language, the church kept up with this and translated everything into English so that our young people can feel that they are part of the church and understand what is happening. Whereas other ethnic churches didn't do this quick enough. Like, for example, I know in Australia, and maybe the same here, some of the other Orthodox churches, continued preaching, and their liturgies were in their ancient language. And so they lost many of their generations that grew up in Australia or America and so on. So the church, the Coptic church, was very much aware of this and translated things into the language that the people understood. Any other questions? Yes.
الحقيقة كان اللغة طبعا شيء مهم بالنسبة لكل شعب ولكل كوميونيتي، فهل الكنيسة ما عندهاش برامج إن احنا نحيي اللغة القبطية تانية ويكون في حاجات عملية مش مجرد إن احنا بنقول كلام، يعني احنا هو مفيش أهداف لكده يعني نقدر نعملها احنا.
I see the hope through our theological colleges. من خلال الكليات اللاهوتية اللي هي يعني مثلا عندي في ملبورن بندرس اللغة القبطية بكذا لهجة، بالبحيري وبالصعيدي. فممكن ان احنا نحيي اللغة القبطية تاني من خلال الكليات اللاهوتية ومن خلال فصول تدرس اللغة القبطية في الكنائس بس we have to realize the importance of how to preserve this heritage because for example في مخطوطات كتيرة موجودة باللغة القبطية محدش حتى فكر يفتحها أو يدرسها أو يشوف إيه اللي إحنا ممكن نستفاده لاهوتيا أو عن تاريخنا من خلال المخطوطات القبطية. كم واحد في الكنيسة القبطية مثلا دارس اللغة القبطية أو بيبص على المخطوطات دي أو يعمل أبحاث عنها ويطلع كنوز منها اللي إحنا كلنا نقدر نستفاد بيها. There is a rich heritage there in the Coptic language that we need to revive, and my hope is that through the theological colleges, whether in Egypt or abroad, that we can revive the Coptic language. But I'll speak more in the third lecture about the theological education. So hopefully tomorrow we'll talk more about this. Thank you.
We are having in our church once every month we have Coptic liturgy. It's all Coptic once, beginning to the end. So it's all Coptic liturgy. We were having that once a month.
This is very good, but next to this, the majority of people will not be understanding the Coptic liturgy. You need, beside this, to have classes in Coptic to encourage people to learn the Coptic language so that they can enjoy the Coptic liturgy. Someone here had a question.
Didn't our fathers write in Greek?
Sorry?
Didn't the fathers of the church write in Greek?
They wrote, some of them wrote in Greek, like Saint Athanasius, but Saint Shinuti, the Archimandrite, all of his writings are in Coptic. He is the most prolific Coptic writer in our history. And you may be aware or not that there is a group of scholars based in Germany that are currently translating the whole literary corpus, all of the writings of Saint Shinuti from Coptic into English and publishing it. So this is a huge task of tens of years. So they wrote in both languages. Any other questions? When you get tired, tell me.
Did this group in Germany, Sayyidina, did they publish anything?
They have published Stephen Emmel, Professor Stephen Emmel. He already published 2-volume work, which was his PhD on Saint Shinuti. But I'm not sure if they have begun to publish any other works or not. But I think soon more is coming.
And whatever he publishes is available?
It will be available. Amazon has everything. Yes.
Is there any book available for Pope Cyrillus IV?
Not in English, as far as I know, because his life was very short, and he didn't write anything. So I found 2 letters, I think, that he wrote to the Patriarch of, or to the Metropolitan of Ethiopia at the time, but he didn't write any books. Yeah. But you may find some material in Arabic. But no, there's not really much there that you could do a full research, a PhD or something like this, to publish a volume. There's just not enough material there. Any other questions? Okay, let us move on a little bit. Tell you a little bit about Habib Davis. Does anyone know when he was born? He is a modern saint in our church now, so you should get to know him. And for me, I live and breathe Habib Gerges every day of my life. I feel like he's a close companion to me. And I'm inspired by him every single day in everything I do in my diocese, because he's really an inspirational figure. And I hope that you will also take him as an intercessor for you. Habib Gerges was born in 1876, and his father's name was Gerges Mankarios, and his mother's name was Miriam. His father died when he was very young, and his mother brought him up in the faith and sent him to the great Coptic school that was near the Patriarchate in Uzbekistan, in Cairo, where he finished his primary and his secondary schooling there. He had 3 siblings, one girl called Martha, and 2 brothers, Ghali and Kamel. So this was the family of Habib Berkes. So his father died when he was 6 years old in 1882. So imagine a young boy at this age in this difficult atmosphere that I'm speaking about. Very easily he could have gone astray, very easily. But it shows you the resilience of his mother Miriam, how strong she was to bring him up in the faith, even though that at some stage of her life she was bedridden and she was paralyzed, but yet she kept looking after him. I have a photo of her when she is sitting on top of her bed, but unfortunately we couldn't connect the laptop, but tomorrow I'll show you a lot of historical photos that I hope you will enjoy. I had the pleasure last year of meeting a family, all by coincidence. This person connected with me on Facebook and said to me that my auntie, who is still alive, was living in the same apartment block as Habib Berkes, and that her father was very close and assisting Habib Berkes with many things. And so I had the opportunity when I was in Egypt last year to actually go and visit them. And they were gracious enough to give me a lot of material that they had preserved about Habib Berkes, actually some fascinating things that now can continue my research to find some more information about him. So I may show you some of this material that I have also on a PowerPoint tomorrow. So his father died in 1882 when he was 6 years old, and his mother, Miriam, looked after him and his other 3 siblings to take them through their education. And as I said, that his mother took him through the great Coptic school where he finished his primary and secondary education. At this time, Pope Carolus V, the longest reigning patriarch, began to think about establishing a theological college because he could see the state of the church and could see the importance of training clergy about theology. So it happened that in November of 1893, so this is how many years now? 125?
Yes.
125 years ago, this November, when the Theological College was established. And there is an important point for you to note here. What Pope Carolus V established in November of 1893, this seminary or theological college, is not the same as what we had established in the 1st century by St. Mark, which was known as the Catechetical School of Alexandria. They are 2 different things. What St. Mark established in the 1st century, the Catechetical School of Alexandria, the purpose of this institution was to prepare people for baptism. Those that were atheists or of different religions that knew Christ, the Catechetical School of Alexandria under certain teachers like Clement of Alexandria or Origen or others, prepared people to be baptized into the Christian faith. That was the purpose of that school in the early centuries. What Pope Carolus V established in November of 1893 was for the first time in our history a seminary, a theological college to train men to become priests. Can you see the difference? Not for baptizing people to become Christians, that was in the early centuries, what was established in 1893 was an institution to prepare young men to be ordained to the priesthood, to be equipped to preach, and to be equipped to be able to offer the sacraments and to go to serve in the churches all over Egypt. So please make that distinction between these two things. The amazing thing is that Habib Gerges was one of the first 40 students to be chosen to enter into the seminary, ended up with 12. He was the top student in the class. But for the first 4 years, there was no teacher of religion. So imagine, they established a seminary, a theological college, but no one to teach theology and religion. And the students were very upset. They were teaching them science, mathematics, philosophy, history, geography, all these different subjects, except for the main purpose why they were there was to study theology and religion. But there was no one to teach. So they decided to bring in Father Philithaus Ibrahim Baghdadi, who was the most learned man in his time in the church, to teach at the seminary. He lasted for 2 weeks. He entered into the class one day and collapsed. They took him home and he died shortly afterwards. So what did Habib Gerges do? He would go into the library of the Patriarchate, which is a very rich library with many manuscripts and books. And he began to read himself and to take notes. And in one of his books, he said he did not leave one book or one page unturned until he had read everything that was in the library and taught himself, because there was no one else to teach him. And when Yusuf Mankarios, who was the dean at the time, saw how advanced he was, they allowed him to teach the first year students that were coming in while he was in his final year as a student at the seminary. And after he graduated, they then appointed him full-time to teach there. So this is what was the beginning of the theological college, and we will talk more about this tomorrow. While he was still a student in 1897, he prepared a very powerful lecture called the Diana Masihiyya, Christian Religion. And he gave this over 2 Sundays at the church in the Patriarchate. And there was the editor-in-chief of Misr newspaper, which was a Coptic newspaper, in attendance at his lecture. His name was Tadros al-Mankabadi. And he was so impressed by this young, eloquent teacher, while still a student. But he gave this powerful lecture, speaking to the audience, saying to them, let's look back at our history. Look at how glorious our church was. We are the church of Athanasius and Cyril, and Clement of Alexandria, and all of these great teachers. And he was quoting from them. And we were leading the whole world in theology through these great teachers of Alexandria. And look at the sad, dismal state that our church has reached now, and this period of darkness. And he said to them, let us put our hands together and let us revive our church to this former glory that we had, and return our church again to this glory. People were very inspired by this lecture. And Tadros al-Mankabadi, the editor-in-chief, took the permission of Habib Gerges to publish this lecture, thousands of copies that he printed and distributed to so many people, to see something new, something is changing in the Coptic church. Who is this Habib Gerges? What is he talking about? We need to begin listening carefully. Because Habib Gerges had a very sonorous voice. when he spoke, you wanted to listen to him. A very powerful voice, a spiritual voice, a man with authority when he spoke, and a man with deep knowledge that you wanted to learn from. Amazing. This is how he began his career, was with this lecture in 1897 at Diana al-Masihiyya, Christian religion. The second lecture he gave was in the church of Harat Sa'ayin in Egypt. And this is an amazing story, that at this lecture now Pope Kyrillos V had begun to hear about this student Habib Gerges. And he went to preach in this church, and Pope Kyrillos V attended his lecture. Imagine the Pope himself is coming to listen to a lecture by a student at the seminary. Quite incredible. And the history says, and he mentions it in one of his books, that the Pope stood on his throne for a whole hour, listening to him speak, having great joy in his heart, blessing him with the cross with every word that he was saying, and blessing the congregation. And the Pope was overjoyed that he could feel that preaching and teaching has been given a new life in the Coptic Orthodox Church through this young man, Habib Gerges. So sometimes you will see I had my iconographer in Melbourne write an icon of Habib Gerges, and he put this as one of the scenes of his life, where Pope Kyrillos is standing on his throne, blessing him as he is preaching. At the time, Pope Kyrillos V began to realize that children were not being educated, and he put out a decree with the Synod how to give importance to Sunday school, or didn't call it Sunday school, but how to give importance to the teaching of Christian faith to children and the importance of bringing them to the church. And Habib Gerges took it upon himself that he should begin to do something about this decree that the Synod put out with Pope Kyrillos V. And that's why in 1898 he began to write a very simple curriculum, a catechism, question and answer, very simple. Who is Jesus Christ? He is the Son of God. Who is Saint Mary? She is the Theotokos, the Mother of God. Simple question, simple answer. Yeah? And in 1900, he began to gather children. Do you know where he gathered these children to teach them? In the church of Abuna Matthias Farid, in St. Mary Church in Faggan. This is where the Sunday school movement began, in St. Mary Church in Faggan. He would gather groups of children, and he would begin teaching them this very simple curriculum of the catechism of question and answer. It was a very primary, primitive way, but it was the beginning, of rote learning. Here is the question, here is the answer, and teaching the children this way. So in my opinion, Sunday school movement started in 1900, but it was formalized in 1918 with the first high Central Committee for Sunday School, and that's why this year the church is celebrating the 100th anniversary since the establishment of that first Central Committee for Sunday School. So it is really a very joyful occasion for the church all over the world to celebrate this occasion. It was fascinating that in the beginning, when he went to preach in the churches, many churches rejected him. كنايس كتيرة رفضته يوعظ في الكنايس بتاعتها. ليه؟ لأن كانوا خافوا منه. The priests feared him because they were ignorant, sorry to say. They were not educated at the time. And who is this young man who is educated, having a theological degree? How is he going to come and overtake our churches? And they even resisted the Sunday school movement. And many of them at the beginning, they would not allow him to establish Sunday school branches in their churches. But he was very intelligent. And to overcome this, he gave them the control of the Sunday school program in their churches. And this is the way that he encouraged them, that they didn't feel like he was coming to overtake their churches, but was there as a great support to them. So he got the clergy to be on his side and the bishops to be on his side, and gave them to own the Sunday school movement. And he continued to develop the curriculum. We'll talk more about this tomorrow. And as I said, established the first Sunday school central committee in 1918. And he put an amazing administrative system in how to run the Sunday school. Quite incredible. But I will keep this till tomorrow to talk about. Not only this, but he gave attention to teaching every single person in the church. He would publish on a weekly basis 4 pages of a Bible study that each family would come to church, take these Bible studies, and to study it all throughout the week, so that the father and the mother and the children would sit together and to study the Bible. Obviously, whether this took place or not, we'll talk more about this and talk about illiteracy tomorrow and talk about what was happening in the villages in Egypt. This is also a fascinating story, but I don't want to give everything away tonight. This is like to just hopefully whet your appetite to want to know more, and hopefully come back tomorrow to hear the many amazing details about this man. He also read a lot. He knew English very well, and I think probably French. And he would bring lots of books from abroad to read about psychology, about education, and implemented these things in his curriculum, established curriculum for the teachers themselves, and how to teach every different age group. He also gave a holistic idea of how to develop a child, and I'll give you some quotes of his tomorrow. Tomorrow I will tell you also about how the students of Sunday schools were teaching their parents at home, and I'll give you a quote from him. Tomorrow I will also tell you about my fascinating journey into the patriarchal archives, which I didn't know anything about. Under the Cathedral of St. Mark in Cairo is a fascinating place that no one knows about. But by God's grace only, I discovered it and discovered many things. I'll tell you more about it tomorrow. For Habib Gerges, he believed one of his battle cries, one of his main battle cries, is that no man should be ordained to the priesthood without first completing a proper theological degree. And unfortunately, till our day and age, we still have not learned this important legacy of Habib Gerges. Someone looks nice, speaks nice, is a Sunday school teacher, that's enough, we ordain them as a priest. But this was not what Habib Gerges taught. مع كل احترامي وكل الآباء الكهنة والأصحاب. لكن this was the legacy of this man. He believed, and he would say, and I will give you a quote, no one can become a doctor unless they go to university and complete a proper medical degree. No one can become a lawyer unless they complete a law degree. No one can build bridges and become an engineer unless they have completed the proper qualifications. then when it comes to the most important thing, which is our salvation and our spiritual nourishment, how can we have people that are not theologically trained to lead our churches? I think it is to our detriment, and if the church does not take this issue so seriously, whether in Egypt or abroad, I wonder what is the future. And that's why the importance of theological education. We'll talk more about this tomorrow. He had an amazing love for the seminary. He talks about it in amazing language, and I will give you some quotes about this tomorrow. I'll tell you about all of his suffering. Don't think it was an easy journey for this man, but he was very resilient, and he never gave up, even in front of the most fiercest storms that he went through. He stood strong like a lion, defending his church, defending the importance of the Sunday school movement and of theological education in the church. And some of the situations he went through in the theological college, it was in an abysmal state, and how he transformed it. And he was resisted, even resisted by a monk from Baramos called Father Eziele Baramosi, who attacked him and wrote letters against him to the lay community council, calling him a thief, calling him all these donations that he's collecting, what is he doing with it, many, many things. And he was also a reformist. He wrote a book at the end of his life in 1942, saying how the church could be reformed in a matter of 10 years, and an idea of how to develop 12 important committees to reform the church and transform it. Many, many things. But at the end of his life, I believe he died in great grief and sadness. And this woman, who was living in the same apartment block when I visited her, she told me something I didn't know before, is that Habib Gerdes was actually paralyzed in the last few years of his life. And I think it was because of the sadness and the grief that he felt that his legacy no one has listened to, or the reform that he wanted for the church, that no one was really following after what he was trying to do for the church. And I'll give you also a quote from one of his close friends, who says of him that the great teacher failed, but he failed the failure of a martyr, because truly he was a martyr without the shedding of blood. This man was truly a martyr without the shedding of blood, because he gave his whole life, every atom in his body, he dedicated the church day and night to reform it and to enlighten the Coptic people, and also to maintain Coptic identity so that we would not lose the richness of our heritage. He was also a poet. He wrote many hymns, several books of hymns. And this is also very important. I'll talk more about this tomorrow. How he preserved the faith of the church through hymnology. As I mentioned, Western missionaries came in, they brought in their Western music, and he didn't want us to lose our Coptic music. So he wrote these hymns teaching about who is the Theotokos, about the sacraments, about the history of the church, but he put the words using Coptic music, from the liturgy, from the tasbihah, from the qiyah praises, so that we preserve our hymnology, but teaching the teachings of the church through simple words to the students. So he wrote several books of hymns as well. We call Saint Cyril IV the father of reform. I believe that Saint Archdeacon Habib Gerdes should be given the title of Father of Education in our modern Coptic history. I feel blessed in every time I speak about this holy saint of our modern Coptic period. And I feel inspired and encouraged in every time that I speak about him. And I hope also that you can get to know him more and know about the legacy that he has left for us and how we can continue his legacy here in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, in New York, in Australia, in Europe, in Egypt, everywhere where the church exists. We need to go. I've only scratched the surface, and I hope that more scholars will go in deeper to know more about the history and the legacy that Saint Habib Berges left for all of us, and glory be to God forever.
I think we were hungry and thirsty, and now we are all filled. Thank you, Sayyidina. Thank you so much. But I have a question. I heard it from somebody about Habib Berges. He told me that he was nominated as a patriarch after Pope Kyrillos V, and he was not a monk. Is that right?
He was actually nominated to be bishop in several dioceses and nominated to be patriarch. And in fact, Pope Kyrillos V would invite him to attend the synod meetings because he was so enlightened, and he would give very wise advice to the synod. And he would have a meeting, I think every Saturday morning at 10 a.m. with Pope Kyrillos V to speak about matters of the church. But as you said, Abuna, that because he was not consecrated as a monk, so he was rejected to be patriarch. But I am glad that he did not become patriarch. Because if he became patriarch, he would not have been able to do all the work that he did for the church in education. He would have been so busy with running the affairs of the church. So it's actually a gift from God that he was not ordained as a bishop or as a patriarch, so that he could do the work that he did for us.
Told me saying that, but in the first, in the old church, the old Coptic church, the usual was that they choose the patriarch or the bishops from the world, not from the monastery. Like Saint Athanasius the Apostle, he was not a monk.
And then it became the tradition afterwards that the Pope would come from the monks with all the bishops.
Where is his body buried, the holy body?
His relics were discovered many years ago where the family tomb was, and now the relics have been transferred to where the original theological college was, which is at St. Mary's Church in Mahmasha in Cairo. And so, as I was completing my PhD in 2014, I got the permission of Bishop Martiros, who is responsible for Mahmasha, to take a part of the relics to my diocese in Melbourne. But I got a bit greedy. So I took all of his upper right arm. شد صغيرة كده بحبه هعمل. So I was able to get all of his upper right arm, and somehow we got it to Melbourne. That's also another interesting story that I might tell you. And so this is a great blessing for my diocese, and I hope one day we can build a cathedral in his name.
Stephen Yefek said that he came up with the idea of the Sunday school. Was the Sunday school already known in the West?
Yeah. So Sunday school movement began maybe 200 years or 100 years before that in Europe. And Western missionaries, as I said, came to Egypt, and I'm sure that he interacted with them. And I have no doubt that he borrowed the idea of Sunday schools from the Western missionaries. But he was very orthodox in his faith. He would have taken the idea and transformed it and given it a Coptic Orthodox flavor. Yeah? Even when he bought books from the West for the students in the theological college, he would take what was suitable and translate it from whatever the original language into Arabic, and giving it also what was suitable for Orthodox faith. I'll take 2 more questions.
What was his relation with Majlis al-Milli?
It was, he was a member of the Majlis al-Milli 3 times. He was elected 3 times with the highest votes. And so he played a significant role in the Majlis al-Milli. But also, concerning finances, they gave him a very difficult time. يعني لما كان بيحاول يطور في الإكليريكية لأن المباني كانت في حالة سيئة جدا للغاية، وهنتكلم عن الموضوع ده شوية بكرة. فكانوا بيتعبوه اللي هم يدوا فلوس، مع إنه كانوا بيصرفوا فلوس في حاجات تانية. هو كان بيقول لهم دي أهم حاجة المفروض اللي أنتوا تهتموا بيها، التعليم في الكنيسة وتعليم اللي هم هيأسسوا كنايس واللي هم هيقودوا كنايس. فكانوا بيتعبوه جدا في الموضوع ده. ومرة قريته الكتاب دلوقتي اترجم عربي وهيتنشر قريب كمان للي ما يعرفش انجليزي. راح دخل اجتماع فجأة بتاع المجلس الملي واتكلم معاهم كلام شديد وما خدش اللي هو عاوزه في الاجتماع ده، فراح كلم البابا كرولوس الخامس. فدي أكيد عملت شوية حساسية بينه وبين المجلس الملي. وبرضه مرقس سميكة باشا اللي هو أسس المتحف القبطي، وده يعني كان شايف نفسه حبتين، كان بيتابعه برضه، ما كانش مقتنع بالعمل بتاعه في الإكليريكية. وحتى في كتاب من كتبه بيتكلم شوية عن الموضوع ده. كان البابا كرولوس بيزور الإكليريكية بعد ما وضبها، فالبابا كرولوس قال لمرقس سميكة باشا، قال له أنا مش عارف إزاي that you are, how can you resist such great work? And there was some resistance there. Okay.
My question is a little bit off topic, but you mentioned earlier that he's being a saint. But can you give us an idea about the criteria of somebody to be a saint without doing miracles? And obviously, it's new to us.
You see, I think this is a problem that we have in the Coptic Orthodox Church today. That many people are running after miracles. And all that people are reading are books of miracles. I do not deny that miracles happen. Miracles do happen, right? But we forget that the greatest miracle that we have every single day is on the altar. The bread and wine that is transformed into the true body and true blood of Christ. And we become united with Him and He becomes united with us. This is the greatest of miracles. But now, unfortunately, the majority of people, all they are running after is books of miracles. And that's all they read. They don't read their history. They don't know their theology. They don't know their doctrine. And you ask someone, they'll say to you, oh, I cannot go to sleep unless I read a miracle of so-and-so and put it under my pillow. But what happened to our Bible? Do we bother to read our Bible every single day and learn? This is very dangerous. So saints is not necessarily for people or for, obviously in our history there is many great saints that performed amazing miracles. No one denies this. But we have to understand also that you can live a very saintly life, but maybe you are not given that virtue of miracles. Yeah? So here we are seeing a new type of saint in our modern era. Someone who was an educator to the highest level in the church. And what was the purpose of the education? Not just for knowledge. The purpose of the education is to transform people's lives to become more saintly and more godlike. That was the purpose of Habib Gerdes in enlightening the people of the Coptic Church. And that's why he deserves to be a saint. I think enough this evening, but I thank you for your attention. I'll be around for a little while if you have other questions, and tomorrow we will continue. In the morning, I'll speak more about the Sunday school movement, and then in the afternoon about theological education. Thank you very much.
Because of the blessing of the presence of Sayyid now, we will give you a discount of the book. So the book of Habib Gabis is in our bookshop here. I think it's $30 or $28, something like this. So we'll give discount 50%. Is that okay with you, Karim? Okay. Karim is the responsible of the bookshop. So Karim is here with us tonight, and I think he will be with us tomorrow and Sunday. If you want to get the book, it's here.
I'm happy to sign any copies if you like.
So you know, sign it when it's over.
Iisus pe Hristos, ieta pașle pe stavlose de complemem satana, sabrăsite neceară, să te amonu nainana chicir, adisil Moisis timeto uiben temeși, să te timet lointe Jacobino menagente mato, sala picate sopente David, sopeia ente solo, Pierneman practiton fieta piege, ni apostolos e choise pe ale onchemeta hoera tempeniote taiot nascere, baba tawadros, nepeniot nebeskopos aba soli elecnotite, vetagruhi genos dronos nahanishin rompinem hanseio enhili, ni conem pesveio enogaji kilos abesiteno, shalom colem toe pe Christos ereie contentamen Nani vokem o healing katapet neshenai Kyrie eleison, Kyrie eleison, Kyrie vlogison amines moe, smoeroi simatramia gonie vol compiesmo.
Christos benot.
Amines eshobi.
Orăm țitiri numai te clinis semnenan te clini cano venan bolgis of te tigomne bemne bezmone bemashanie min. O Lord, make us worthy to pray thankfully. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Through Christ Jesus our Lord, for thine is the kingdom, power, and glory forever. Amen. The love of God the Father, and the grace of his only begotten Son, and the gift and fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all. Go in peace. May the peace of the Lord be with you.